All right, I see it is 12 o'clock, and so hopefully the folks I see in the participant group are here for Managing Forests as Habitat in a Changing World. My name's Jeff Horan. I'm one of the hosts of this webinar panel series, and today we're specifically going to be talking about public use, recreation, and management in forested habitats. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gwyneth Dalton from our National Conservation Training Center, and she's going to take us through some of the things before we get started on our webinar. Go ahead, Gwyneth. You are
I
muted.
am muted. Here we go. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jeff. Yes, I am here at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and we welcome you to our webinar series. This iteration of the webinar is titled Public Use, Recreation, and Management in Forested Habitats. We have a great panel for you today, and we'll introduce them in a little bit. We're going to go over some pre-webinar items. And so first, if you need closed captioning, we do have closed captioning for you. And so you can find that if you need that. We also have ASL interpreters that I'm sure will be on any minute now. And so first and foremost, we would like to do our land acknowledgement. Here at the National Conservation Training Center, we realize that we are located on unceded ancestral lands of many Indigenous people. While we can't find a full account of the folks who traversed this land and cherished this land, we do know that some of these people include, but are not limited to, the Massachusetts, Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. And if you would like more information about how to make a land acknowledgement for the place that you live and work, let us know and we can help you out. Also, here at the National Conservation Training Center, we welcome everyone. We acknowledge our agency's history and strive to be a cultural site of transformation. And we realize that everyone has a say, and we acknowledge that bringing ideas and perspectives from a lot of different people is important. A little disclaimer, this is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of Interior. Some of the material and images may be protected by copyright and may be licensed us by third parties and restricting their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. That being said, we have a bunch of good links that will be put into the chat. And so make sure to check those links out. And if you have any other questions about references, let us know and we can try our best to help you. This webinar, like every webinar, is being recorded. And so we have a great list of previously recorded webinars on our NCTC page for this Forestry College webinar series, as well as on YouTube as well. And so we are being recorded, and a lot of you can't have your videos on, which is unfortunate, but you can introduce yourself in the chat. And so you can see the chat box down on the left-hand side. And then we also welcome questions during this webinar series, but do not put your questions in the chat. Please put your questions in the Q&A box, which is on your right. And then we will get to that at the end of the webinar. We'll have about a half hour at the end of the webinar to go over questions. So feel free to add your questions in there and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. Make sure when you chat, folks, that your setting is on everyone and not just the panelists. We would love to see your comments and questions, but maybe everyone wants to see them as well. For the best viewing of this webinar, I would go to speaker view, and then you can see all of our wonderful presenters. And here's a fun little update. So our webinar series is going to switch from Zoom to Teams. This will happen for the October 21st webinar. So our September webinar is still on Zoom, but we'll be switching to Teams in October. Make sure that you are registered to this current webinar, and then we will take the list of everyone that's registered for this webinar and admit them into Teams. If there is anyone that you know that isn't quite registered for this webinar yet and wants to see it in the future, let us know. These webinars will still be recorded and you can still view them after the fact. And if you have any questions or concerns about this switch, you can email me. My email is below, Gwyneth_Daunton at fws.gov. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff and to start the webinar.
Thanks, Gwyneth. And so just to let everyone know, so this is our eighth webinar in this 12-part series, and it's again sponsored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Forest Ecology Working Group and other groups within Fish and Wildlife Service as well. It's also sponsored by the Northern Forest Climate Hub and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and the USDA Forest Service. And you can see the names up there. If you have questions for our Forest Ecology Working Group, who really is the group that coordinates this, or if you have webinar questions, there's Gwyneth. And then if you need continuing education credits for either the Wildlife Society or Society of American Foresters, you need to reach out to Jim Siegel. You can self credit for the Wildlife Society. So there's Jim's email right there, Jim Siegel at fishandwildlifeservice.gov. Next slide, Gwyneth, please. So again, it's a 12-part series, and we feature these interactive panel discussions, and they've been really good discussions so far. And we're talking about these, climatic shifts. We're talking about changes in forest habitats and the adaptation options for natural resource management. And we try to get pretty diverse panels. Today's panel is pretty focused in the Northeast, I will say. So if folks see contrasts in how we're managing public uses in other parts of the country, go ahead and put that into questions or the chat, so we can also, maybe some of our panelists will address that as well. And so also next, we like to give a brief advertisement for our next webinar. And our next webinar is Tuesday, September 16th. We're almost always on the third Tuesday of each month. And in this case, it's finding refuge in suburbia. So it's managing forest for habitat in an urban environment. And we have 4 excellent panelists. I think it'll be a really interesting discussion. We have somebody from Cal Fire. We have somebody from the Extension Service in Florida. So it's a pretty broad-reaching panel. We have somebody from a Sustainable Forestry Initiative that's focused on urban forestry. So it should be a good conversation. Please join us. Next slide, Gwyneth. Okay, today's panel. Okay, so Danielle Shannon is from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science in Michigan Tech. She's a coordinator there. We have Ethan Tapper. Ethan's a forester. He's also the author of How to Love a Forest, and he's a consulting forester and has his own 200-acre forest that he's been part of. So I also I've been reading his book, How to Love a Forest, and it's I'm enjoying it, so I recommend it. We also have Kathryn Wrigley. Kathryn is a recreation specialist with the state of Vermont for forest, parks, and recreation. So it even has recreation in its name. And so Kathryn's also a licensed forester. So, she's right in the niche of what we want to talk about. Alison Adams is here from the Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative. Alison is the director of the cooperative, and that's based at University of Vermont. And so they built some really cool tools for how to look at these various things. And then Sean Flint is a colleague, a past colleague of mine. Sean's a wildlife biologist at our Umbagog National Wildlife Refuge. That's kind of northern, all the way northern New Hampshire and into Maine as well. And Sean's been wearing lots of hats lately, and recently he's been the acting refuge manager as well as the biologist there. And my name is Jeff Horan. I'm a forest ecologist with Fish and Wildlife Service, although I am retired. So I'm not sure why I'm here, but I enjoy doing it. So glad you guys are all here. And with that, I'm going to be your moderator today, and I'll be pitching questions to our panel to get things started. And then at 1 o'clock, we'll take questions from you guys, and we'll try to do our best to address some of those. And And we have some folks behind the scenes, Lindsay and Haven, and they'll be, and our panelists will be posting relevant links that you guys can grab, and they will be. Gwyneth mentioned that the webinar series is recorded and it will be on our NCTC website. And we also try to, with the recording, we try to provide these links as well. So next slide. I think that's it. Okay, with that, so our first question. So this slide is going to get Kathryn started. But here, the first question I wanted to start with. Again, we have a series of different specialists here. You know, they're all working around forestry as a whole, but they're specialists. So, as specialists working in a changing forest, what are some of the likely challenges and opportunities we face when managing all these multiple uses, like recreation, like forestry and wildlife management, and again, all these additional public uses. We don't often get a chance to talk about, kind of public uses. We're focused more on forest management. So, what are the challenges? And I'll throw it to Kathryn first because her slide was up, and go ahead, Kathryn. And
All
Gwyneth,
right.
you can put
All
that back
right.
up for a second. Yeah.
So, hello, I'm Kathryn Wrigley. I'm both a licensed forester, as Jeff mentioned, and I work for the Department of Forest, Parks, and Rec in Vermont. I'm speaking based on my understanding and knowledge, but what I say doesn't necessarily reflect the department's views. And yeah, so I wanted to start with this. For those of you not in the Northeast, I know there's been flooding across the country. This is from flooding in July I'm pretty sure this is the 2023 flood. And I just thought it was good because in Vermont, a huge challenge for recreation is flooding, because not only does it can affect or impact the actual recreation infrastructure, like maybe your trail is gone, but it can also be a challenge when flooding at like the scale that you see in these photos occurs, when the trail might be fine, but maybe a road is out, or a town is trying to figure out how to deal with damage in their town, and also trying to manage people who are trying to access the recreation resources that surround them. So that's sort of why I prompted with that. And then if you go to the next slide, I just like to contextualize recreation as this, the one with this. So I also like to contextualize recreation as sort of, there's these things outside of our control, flooding, and other sorts of events that can occur. And then also, this is what's drawing people in. So you can see this is a photo of Camel's Hump, which is an iconic mountain in Vermont. One is in the winter, the other is in the fall. Leaf peeper season is a huge time for us. And then the colorized photo is a black and white photo from 1927 of the first 3 women who through hiked the long trail unaccompanied, meaning that there was not a man with them. And I just wanted to sort of bring up these two things. Is I brought up the iconic mountain because a lot of times it's hard when you're thinking about a resource from a forest perspective or wildlife perspective or other natural resource lens, because you might be looking at a certain thing, and then recreationists, they're like, well, I want to hike Camel's Hump, and they come to your place just to hike that. So that's like, there's this this is to highlight the human component, which is can be so unpredictable. So you can take that down, but I just wanted to share those to sort of highlight that people have been in the woods and hiking and doing sort of what we might call outdoor recreation now. Recreation can be a big word. It can encapsulate hunting and fishing and trapping. It can encompass picnicking, kickball. I just mentioned through hiking, so it can long-term backpacking, mountain biking. So for this, I'm just going to define how I'm talking about it in this. And so for me, I'm going to be thinking of sort of that more outdoor recreation with the biking, hiking, skiing, etc. And then also the hunting, fishing, and trapping. And for me, that tends to usually be more in the fish and wildlife because there's like a long tradition of fish and wildlife managing it. And then I spent a lot of time thinking about those other groups of people. And the challenges and opportunities are, I know, right? I'm a talker. So the challenges and opportunities are that people like being outside. More and more people have been wanting to go outside since COVID. There is a lot of general support for exploring the woods, nature, lakes and ponds, etc. So I think the opportunity is we have a captive audience of people who are trying to get into the woods, wanting to be healthy, wanting to learn. And the challenge is, how do we communicate with them? Because there's a ton of dispersed things. They cross from state land to federal land to public land to private land and don't know. So there's this huge opportunity for communication. And so I'll start there, and then that can sort of open it up to, well, that opens up it's a whole can of worms.
Thanks, Kathryn. So let me pitch it to Ethan, because Ethan has a perspective from a forester's standpoint and doing forest management, but mostly on private land, I suspect. But Ethan also communicates with lots of folks that's from different perspectives. So what do you want to? And then I'll come to Sean from the federal perspective. So go ahead, Ethan.
Thank you. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting thing to think about, and one of the reasons is that from an ecological perspective, and sometimes from a forest management perspective as well, we think of recreation and people's use of forests, whoever owns them, as something that needs to be managed, right? It's potentially a problem, and there's all these potential issues with it, and we can talk about what those are and the way that they are. But the other thing that's interesting is that I think that there's an opportunity there as well, right? Like, there's no doubt that humans are in many ways like one of the biggest things that need to be managed, one of the biggest potential threats to ecosystems, and they're also a conservation asset. And I spend a lot of time talking to people and sort of managing that side of the equation, right? Dealing with hundreds of thousands of people on social media and doing public speaking and doing this writing, and it's important that we realize that the way that most people experience nature and the way that they build a conservation ethic and the way that they develop values where they value those things and they advocate for those things is on a trail, right? And is doing these recreational activities. So it's not just something that's like a pain in the butt that we need to manage and mitigate. It can also be something that can be a real asset that if we use it correctly and we manage it correctly, can really feed into a lot of our conservation objectives.
Thanks, Ethan. That fits just perfectly. So let me toss it over to Sean, because Sean, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I mean, we're kind of required to do what we do for people. So with that, I'll turn it over. You don't have intense numbers of people at Umbagog, but you get plenty of different uses. So go ahead.
Yeah, so let me set the stage for everybody on this a bit. Keeping in mind that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Wildlife Refuge System have a fairly narrowed focus, narrowed mission, and where we are that mission is focused on wildlife and habitat management. While the National Wildlife Refuge System does encourage a public use, that public use has a nexus to being wildlife dependent. So whether that's consumptive uses like hunting or fishing, or non-consumptive uses like wildlife photography or observation, there's going to be a tie to wildlife for whatever recreational opportunities we're supporting and promoting on refuges. I share a similar view to what Ethan had expressed, at least here at Umbagog, located in far northern New England, where there is we're embedded in an area with a culture of an open land use. When I say that, I mean public lands are generally considered open for public recreation for traditional uses, unless posted otherwise. And here in Bagog, we follow that same approach. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was not going to be accepted in this part of the world if we approach things where what I might describe in more urban areas or other locations I've worked at on the East Coast, where the refuge is generally closed to public access with the exception of developed access points, trails, auto tours, things of that nature. And on Bagog, the entire 40,000 acres is open for the public to use for approved uses. Again, those that I had thrown out there earlier as examples. That said, we do have a couple of limited developed trails that we maintain, but the public is welcome to engage in their wildlife-dependent recreational activities wherever they would like to explore on the refuge. So that said, the forest management program that we have here in Bagog, which we've had established for about 15 years or so now, I think complements more than contradicts recreational opportunities here. The habitat that we're improving, I think, lends itself well to the hunting crowd, and the habitat that we're improving for non-game species fits very well with the non-consumptive crowd, your bird watchers, your wildlife photography enthusiasts. So I find that we have more complementary uses than I do contradictory here. And just as one example, I'll go ahead and throw out a couple of examples. Our forest management infrastructure that lends itself very well to access into these big woods that this area supports for those recreationists. And while snowmobiling, it may not be a direct related wildlife dependent use, it does facilitate use of the refuge during the wintertime. And our road network lends itself very well to that use on the refuge. So I think there's a lot of ways in which the infrastructure and the management nests very well with recreational opportunities.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. And I'll just say that that building roads to get into some of these forest management activities also allows additional recreational access that wouldn't otherwise exist. So with that, let me change gears just a little bit and go to Danielle and then to Alison, and that is to bring in, and again, you guys can still comment on these, what the challenges and opportunities are, but I'm going to add in kind of this adaptation, the potential for adaptation. We're seeing a lot of things changing with the forest. We're seeing a lot of mismatches in phenology between species and their habitats. So, how do we adjust to that with planning and decision making? So with that, I'll bring that. Please add some information to that, Danielle, and then we'll go to Alison. And please remember to introduce yourself just a little bit too.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I'm Danielle Shannon. I am a climate adaptation specialist with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and a research scientist at Michigan Technological University. The work that I do is to help land managers sort of work through this mire, this complexity of doing things as we've always done them in that business as usual context, as far as taking steps to maintain and maintain and persist as far as the management or conservation or attitudes that we have for our lands, versus taking in this concept of change and weighing the trade-offs and the risks of meeting that change now in the near term, taking steps to adapt our roadways or meeting new recreational demands, versus waiting it out a little bit and observing. And that's because every single land manager or steward or landowner has a very different risk tolerance for these changes and attitude based on their own values, or maybe even in this conversation, the visitors that they are intending to meet every year when it comes to recreation. As Jeff pointed out, we are thinking about, from my organization standpoint, thinking more about that forest change and the effects of a changing forest and the cascading effects it could have on water availability, on habitat, and on recreation. But I do want to point that recreation is actually a really interesting and very unique topic because it involves humans. And so when we're not only trying to conceptualize this hugely difficult equation of how the land will change and what that will mean for us now and in future, we are also overlaying this this other impact, which are people coming. And as the climate continues to warm and it becomes more opportunistic for people to get out there at different times of the year, that that impact is going to become ever present. So I think that is really the crux of the challenge of the conversation today is how do we, responsibly, think about the challenges that come with a changing climate while also meeting that increased demand and, maybe even the different uses that come along with that. So I just wanted to point that out that, climate change is going to have an effect on all lands, but not all lands will be affected in the same way. And similarly, when it comes to recreation, I think, just to sort of close here, I think there is a tension between, managing or thinking about these places in the context of now versus in the realm of recreation. Can we still maintain ski slopes and trails along riverways? Can we responsibly still have these campsites and these locations, or do we need to start thinking about the risks that come along with that and preparing for them in our land management? And I can talk more about those tools after. I want to let Alison jump in now.
Yeah, thanks for that. Go ahead. So, Alison, I think you have a unique perspective because the forest ecosystem monitoring cooperative, you're trying to look at all these things and also, build some tools to address them. So with that, go ahead and introduce yourself a bit.
Yeah, sure. So I'll try and keep my thoughts brief because I've already had I have so many notes of things that I want to say related to what people have said. But for folks who aren't familiar with the Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative, just so you understand kind of where I'm coming from, we are a collaborative that works with state agencies, federal agencies, nonprofits, researchers to help with data management, data synthesis, data analysis, tools and products that can support the work of folks who are managing forests on the ground. And so when I'm really thinking about this question of how do we think about our planning and decision-making processes in the context of adaptation and climate change, I'm really thinking about how do we make the most use of the data we have now? Because one of the big things is that we know we don't have time at this point. In Vermont alone, we've seen a ton of impacts already to our forests. We've had a couple of years of a lot of precipitation, followed by now we're in the middle of a pretty severe drought. But we had a lot of precipitation in the spring. So we have these swings back and forth, which are really jerking our forests around. And that does have an impact on the condition of those forests. And then you also bring in people using those spaces. And I have a lot of thoughts about that I'll try to mention in a moment. But that also complicates that situation. And so we have, and I know this because at FDMC, we have a data archive and it's got thousands of data sets. And I know most of them aren't being used. So we just have this plethora of information and people are constantly producing more information and saying, okay, well, we need to ask a research question about this. But my question is often, have we done what we can do with the information that we have? Are we making decisions based on, all the great work that people have already done and then really incorporating the best current data on these questions and then, making management decisions based on those. And so that's something that FEMC tries to do. It's a huge task. We have a really small staff, but we try to bring in whatever information there is or synthesize, right now we're doing a project bringing together whatever data we can find just on spruce fir forest health, for example, just saying, hey, here are the data that are available on this question. And if you want to do something with it, start here, because there's a lot of people who have already asked questions related to this. So I think for us, that's one of the major things we think about is how do we make the best use, given that time is of the essence, of the data that we already have to create tools and also make management decisions. And then at the risk of going on too long, I also just really do want to underscore this point and sort of challenge everybody who's here to really think about how the ways that we're conceptualizing the relationships between people and nature kind of really underscore this idea that it's a dichotomy where they're kind of in conflict. And that one, doesn't reflect reality, and two, can also sort of reinforce those ideas that people are bad for nature, people are separate from nature, there's these two things going on, and how do we manage that? When in reality, it's much, much, much more complex than that. You have relationships, just like with people, go both ways. And there are benefits and there are drawbacks of those relationships. And so one of the questions that I really think about is how do we build those relationships so that those benefits are as present as possible and really helping the forest as much as possible.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm going to try to go back around for the group again and give everyone another shot at this. What I want to focus us on a little bit this time is thinking a little bit about, all right, do we need some sort of interdisciplinary team when we're trying to think about public use and recreation and forest management and wildlife habitat management? I know when I worked for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, when we began forest certification and we would go look at activities on our state forests, for instance, it used to be the forester did the plans by himself, and then a group of critiques would come in and basically challenge that, right? But when we went through certification, we changed that completely, and we brought in the fisheries biologists, the wildlife biologists, the heritage ecologists, and we brought in social scientists, and it completely changed how we managed our state forest land, because all those people were bought into this process of managing the forest, and so that changed everything we did. And so I'm wondering, for this what are the processes we set up now? Who do we need to be part of these processes? Yeah, so I'll leave it there. I'll go back to Kathryn, and then we'll try to go back in the same order. But again, if folks want to really break in, I think it's okay to do that. But just if you break in, just hit that and let the next person go. Go ahead, Kathryn.
Yeah, great. So in Vermont, we are already lucky enough that our management of state-owned lands does sort of have this interdisciplinary approach that you're talking about. And I would say the other really exciting thing is that the federal government actually created, because recreation has been like a growing challenge, they did create the let's see if I can do this, Interagency Visitor Use Management Committee? The last word is wrong, but it's basically, it was a group, it's 10 years old. It's 10 years this year. I don't work for the feds. I'm just speaking as like, I have used this tool and gone to a lot of webinars and workshops on it. And so I am using it as a state employee in my job. And basically it was the visitor use management framework came out of this group, and the group who made the visitor use management framework was composed of U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Army Corps, MTS, Forest Service, ANOAA came in at the end, and I think someone else. And it's created this huge, robust process that can be scaled to, I used it for an 8-acre island that gets very little use, but we needed to figure out how to manage use, because when Lake Champlain gets low, you can walk to it. So we were trying to figure out a plan for what to do there. And then you can also use it, they've used it at Arches and Acadia and like large scale planning for a whole area. So I did send links, and I think I won't go over it, but it's basically like this amazing tool that does what you're talking about, Jeff. And it creates that space to not only bring in the voices of other experts around natural resources, but depending on sort of how engaged or how sparkly your project might be, there is also the opportunity for you to engage early on with like a partner organization. Like in recreation management, I work more with partner organizations on a day-to-day basis sometimes than colleagues with the same job as myself. So it gives you the opportunity to bring in those other experts, but they're from outside of your organization. And then it lays out this process where you can objectively talk about recreation and think about it in this context of like, we know that there's an impact of humans, and what is the line of impact we're not okay with, and linking that back to management goals, objectives, etc. So I feel like that's a really powerful tool. And then it partners with some other things that I won't elaborate on now to give someone else a chance to talk.
Thanks for that, Kathryn. Yeah, that sounds great. So Ethan, what about do you feel like you can do the same kind of things on private land? I guess I'll, kind of toss it that way. But again, if you had another direction, that's fine too.
Sure, yeah, and I apologize, Jeff, for not introducing myself at the beginning of the last one. I'll just say that my name's Ethan Tapper. For many years, I was a service forester working for the state of Vermont. In Vermont, we call them county foresters. And I recently, last year, started my own business. So I'm now a consulting forester and an author, and a little bit into this world now of being an influencer, which is deeply strange. And so I would say that I'm sort of now equal parts forester and a communicator. So, it's an interesting thing on private lands. I think one thing that has been a real asset for us in managing recreation, private lands and state lands as well, is interacting with organizations rather than individuals really helps. So in Vermont here, we have, like, for mountain biking, a bunch of chapters of, like, the Vermont Mountain Biking Association, VIMBA. We have organizations that represent backcountry skiers, and that really helps because, and rock climbers and other uses as well, snow machines. It really helps because it gives us, like, this other way to reach out to folks and have that community hold itself accountable, and also have a direct line of contact for when we have an issue or when we have something coming up. The other thing that I think is an interesting part of the team to consider is that we're really realizing that public opposition to active forest management, ecosystem stewardship, restoration is a barrier to adaptation. And so a really important part of how we plan for these this recreation as it occurs on private lands, as it occurs on public lands, is figuring out then how we're going to leverage these recreational resources to help people better understand forest stewardship, so that when we need to have these interventions where we're going in to create habitat for a species of concern, to make our forests more climate resilient, to do these interventions that we need to do in this moment to care for our forests, that we can do that. And so I had some, in my previous capacity as a county forester, I managed some community forests, these town forests, small scale, municipally owned public lands. And it was a really cool opportunity to experiment with how we can leverage recreational trail resources to help people better understand forest management generally. I think that's something that we often think about. How do we separate these uses? How do we separate the active management from the recreation, anticipating that blowback? But it can also be an opportunity to build a better culture of forest management so that we don't get the blowback in the first place. And I have some resources I can drop in the chat about that.
Thank you. That's great, Ethan. Thank you. So I'm going to pass it to Sean, but and I'm thinking about, Sean, we have so many restrictions in our forest management on refuges because wildlife is absolutely our top priority. So we have these things like compatibility determinations and things like that. So it just comes to mind. So if you want to share a little bit about processes and how we get to the management, maybe that might be good. But again, if you had something else in mind, I don't want to stop you from that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jeff. I don't have a whole lot to add, but maybe like Ethan, I had failed to give a more thorough introduction. So let me just take a moment to start with that. For most of my career, I've worked in the National Wildlife Refuge System, and for the last 15 years of which I've been stationed here in Bagog National Wildlife Refuge, where forestry staff and myself have built a reputable, ecologically oriented forest management program. And that's why I believe I was asked to participate in this panel today, is because of that context. Now, getting to the question, Jeff, I think similar to what Kathryn had presented with her state example, on the federal side of things, when it comes to public lands, we have this fairly thorough process associated with NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act requirements for any of our management that occurs in the refuge system. At least in my experience, that has been done through our comprehensive conservation planning process. So we put these plans together, that lifespan of which approximately 15 years, in which we very thoroughly go into what our intended management is. That also addresses recreation activities and other aspects occurring of management and uses occurring on the refuge. And to Jeff's point, yes, there are compatibility determinations that need to be completed to ensure whatever recreational activities do align with the purposes of the refuge and with the priority public uses as outlined in the National Wildlife Refuge System. So again, similar process to what Kathryn had laid out, but just a slightly different version of that on federal lands.
Thanks, Sean. So passing it to Danielle and then coming down to Alison. I know you probably have things you want to address, but I will tee up maybe something that Ethan said, and that was overuse can be a barrier to adaptation. But again, you don't have to tackle that. I'll let you guys go with what's in your frontal lobe.
Yeah, that is an interesting one. I want to actually jump back to the interdisciplinary team question. And just to point out that in our work, which the work that I do is really centered more on the site. So it's, I do work at a variety of different scales when it comes to land management planning and conservation, but often like some of the most interesting work is at that site level, because you can really dig into the complexities of, what this land is, and all of those ideas. But we have found over the years that the best work that we get comes from an interdisciplinary team. And that's because, we are sort of, especially in an agency mindset, sort of schooled in being the expert. You can get this done by yourself, but that really does only allow the plan to reflect your own lens and how you see the world. And so when we bring in that interdisciplinary team, it can help us, it can help us even see challenges that were not even apparent to us. And that can come from taking time to evaluate the place, its history, who the people were that were there before us, thinking about what we're observing now when it comes to effects of, climate, hydrology, and thinking about how those ecosystems will change and what that will influence for, the people that we expect to come when it comes to recreation. I do want to point out that we've had really great success when we're working with forest managers to include people who are thinking about the forest from that other lens. So folks like Ethan who care about wildlife management, people who are thinking about hydrology in the same place. Also, cultural and tribal perspectives bring a lot to the table and I think are often dismissed. It is sometimes challenging, but we do love to have the engineers also in the room. It's really great to have the people who are well-schooled in communication, because a lot of people who work outside are really good at working outside, but aren't great at talking to other people. And that's for one reason or another. So I just want to point that out. And I want to put some examples in the chat of how we have worked with interdisciplinary teams on a national forest to think about a changing climate in the context of day use camping on a river side while maintaining those uses. There were some changes that needed to be made so that the infrastructure was less vulnerable to flooding and extreme winds and even geological failures. And then another story about a group from Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources who had to create or reevaluate their management plan for a state natural area and listen to the community of tribal members and other community members who were very interested in being part of that planning process to revive wild rice in that place. And so two really great examples for folks to dig into and just to set that out there that it can be done, that climate change presents huge challenges, but taking time to listen and bring everyone to the table can really create that, the most robust product and resolve a lot of conflicts down the road. So I'll pass it to Alison.
Great. Go ahead, Alison.
Yeah, so it might be, I don't know how smoothly it's going to follow from what Danielle said, but I think on this point about the cases where there are concerns about, the impact of having too many people in a particular area and how that might, affect abilities of forests to adapt. FEMC does have a tool that we recently produced that was related to recreation, and there's sort of two aspects of that. One is a suite of geospatial products that these are both the geospatial products are specific to the Northeast, and those look at they employ Strava data to look at hiking and mountain biking across the region. So like sort of the relative density of those activities occurring on trails, impervious surfaces across the landscape. They also look a little bit at like if you use buffers from those trails of different distances to account for different kinds of wildlife, like what are the sizes of core areas that are left, and then also soil susceptibility to recreation. So those those geospatial products don't provide an answer. It's not like, oh, this is what needs to be managed and these areas are fine, but they allow people to come with a question and then, use those tools to try and answer that question themselves. So that's one. And then the other half of that project was an analysis or an inventory of methods that could be used for monitoring recreation across the landscape, depending on what forest health variables you might be concerned about. And so both of those are available on our website, and I'll drop the link into the chat right now in case people would like to go check them out. So, I think, well, I do feel really strongly that we really need to be thinking about like these interactions as relationships, and how do we build that relationship as strong as we can to make it so that you can have more people on the landscape who have a strong and positive relationship with that landscape in a way that they want to help steward it, and that their presence can be a benefit. I know there are concerns in a lot of places where people may be coming without a strong relationship to that particular place, and may not know how to best care or steward that particular place, and that we want to manage those kinds of things. And so these tools are to try and help people identify for their area how they might go about that.
Thank you, Alison.
Can I just jump in quickly, Jeff?
Absolutely. I think that's where we are. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to clarify, I was not saying that too many people on the landscape as being a barrier to adaptation, but that public opposition to management as being a barrier to adaptation. So understanding that, like, we need to do these interventions to take care of ecosystems, and also people's use of ecosystems, I would say. And those interventions are seldom things that everybody loves and everybody's cool with all the time in every stage of how they play out. And so what I'm saying is that I think that powerful like communication in concert with, as you mentioned, Danielle, having a communicator as being like part of that team, communication in concert with the management that we do can be a really powerful way to not just like help people be happier with the work that we're doing, but then ultimately to like leverage that recreation into better ecological outcomes and ultimately better human outcomes by improving public perception of these management interventions that we got to do.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So again, I'll let folks just join in here, but a couple things do come to mind. I mean, we decided as a group that we really didn't want to talk about conflicts, and so, but I will say, sometimes it is helpful when those things bring themselves here. I know in Ethan's book, for instance, he talks about, everybody loves beach, but we have to, beach has so many problems now, so we have to do things with it. We also had Tara Kaiser speak in our series last year, and she talked about the mesophysification of our forests, where you're having all these species that are tolerant, relatively tolerant to shade, and it changes our forest completely. And it's not the forest that we would really should be out there. And we don't, as a society, we are concerned about opening up the forest to let enough light in to allow the species like oak, that is a resilient species that should be moving north to address those things. So, you might hit on that, but again, if you guys have other things you want to hit on, I'll just let it roll here a bit. We have about, almost 15 more minutes before we hit the questions from the group. Go ahead.
One of the things that I always have been thinking a lot about now is, I'm not sure, I know there's a lot of people on this, but what I feel is recreation management is like also, like people identify as foresters and they have a forestry degree, or wildlife biologists and they have a wildlife biology degree, and like recreation management, their Parks, Rec, and Tourism is like an established academic interest with like a lot of studies. And so what I've been hearing a lot about this is people are really interested and the impact people have on the woods. And I would love to see like a little more capacity on the like managing the people side, because it's really, you can know everything that is going to happen, but if you don't put in the effort to work on the communication or to rehab the trails, like I participated in a NIAX adaptation workbook workshop a few years ago, which led to me thinking of the Burroughs Trail project, which for me was my biggest project that I've had in Vermont. We rehabbed a whole 2.1 mile fall line trail. And it's still a fall line trail, but we used hardening and a variety of other tactics due to natural resource constraints. But again, trying to balance that people in the natural resource space. And I think it would be great if people thought to themselves, like, is there a person thinking about the human side of my concern right now? And like, how do I talk to them? Because managing just from, I'm not sure how far we can get managing just from the natural resource perspective if we aren't also engaging experts on the the social science side of things, because they're the ones who are going to be able to be like, oh yeah, you put up that sign and no one's going to read it. Or, you know, like they have done extensive research on attitudes, motivations, behavior, which is all, we're basically trying to like control behavior. Really, that's like what rec management is. And that's really hard. So yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to go to that of like, experts exist everywhere and social scientists have expertise in this area.
Does somebody want to jump in?
I know I didn't really set it up. I'm sorry.
No, Danielle. I knew Danielle would want to.
I can sort of see where you're going, and Kathryn wrote me in by saying NIAX. I think that that's absolutely true, and this is a really interesting part of. So when we're thinking about lands, you know, it's from our perspective at the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, we're there to recognize that there's a lot of different perspectives on the land. So in one place, someone's going to see the trees for something completely different, right? And so we might be able to think about the landscape and how it might change, how hazards could change, how wildfire behavior may change, you know, the context of the ecosystem. But yeah, we are often lacking the human side of that, so that when people come to these places, how are we accounting for their health and safety outside of just hazard trees or maintaining a road? And with a changing climate, we're really looking at these challenges to maintaining health and safety are rising much rapidly than I think everyone is completely aware of. So yes, there are people on our staffs who are very keenly attuned to it, but we're not all thinking about it in that way. So we're thinking of like, we need to start becoming more aware of that increase in human disease vectors. You know, we're all knowing that ticks are rising, noxious plants. But are we communicating that? Do our visitors understand that? There's a huge influence of changing longer growing season are having on pollen generation. That's having an effect. People are coming to these places. They're coming at the times that they would always come to, but the stressors in those time periods are increasing. So extreme heat, extreme floods. And so there are resources out there to help people start conceptualizing how, you know, we need to start thinking about communication so that people aren't stuck out there with heat-related illnesses, or just, you know, dehydration, or just stuck in the wilderness when they are actually not prepared for emergency circumstances. So when we're working with recreation people, that is actually like a huge confounding moment for the interdisciplinary team, is saying, oh my gosh, how are we going to get out there to help people? Should we close these trails in different times of the year? Does this, you know, all use trail actually become a certain seasonal trail now? It's no longer open at different times of the year. So I think that it adds a whole new layer and complexity to thinking about the landscape than maybe we're well versed in at this time, and something to work on.
Yeah, thanks for that. I guess, Alison, I'll ask you. You know, Kathryn brought up the whole issue of the human piece of this. How many of your data sets, for instance, are human data sets versus ecosystem, you know, based metrics? And then we'll head over to Ethan and Sean and let them join in somewhere.
Jeff, I have so many things to say. So also, secret hat that I wear that I didn't mention. So I just last year finished my PhD specifically in the relationships between people and nature. So if you're picking up that that's a major thread for me, that's actually why. And so I actually am one of the social scientists who's already working in this space. And I will say, very embarrassingly, I do not know the answer to your question. I don't know how many of our few thousand data sets are related to people. I think I've maybe seen a couple. So I'm guessing it's a pretty low percentage. We don't anybody can upload a data set. So I don't have my hands in most of the ones that are on there. And that's why I'm not, intimately familiar. But yeah, it's definitely a gap. I think FEMC's history is really as like a sort of strictly ecology-based organization. And I think some of that is coming through, but that's something that has been changing over time as we have people with different backgrounds working at FEMC and thinking about these things more holistically. So yeah, so I think it's sort of the non-answer to your question. I don't know, but I think we're headed sort of in the direction of thinking a little bit more about those things for a variety of reasons, not least because of who we have on staff right now. And then I also sort of wanted to throw a point in there in response to what Danielle was saying. I really loved her point because I had mentioned earlier how these are sort of multi-directional relationships between people and nature. And I think that really underscores that, right? A lot of this conversation is like, how do people impact, how is people's recreation impacting the forest? But I think this idea of like, how is the forest also impacting people is like a part of the equation that you really have to be thinking about. And it's not even just beyond like, what might the negative impacts on people be, but you could even take that one step further and say, okay, if some people are having negative experiences, or they're just sort of fearful of the forest because they're hearing about those kinds of things, how does that actually influence the positive relationships that they might have? And then what their sort of relationship is with those places, their willingness to engage with those places and build that relationship. What does that look like for future generations? Many of us already have these relationships. A lot of research shows that those relationships are relatively stable despite these things. But as people are forming those new relationships, what does that mean? And sort of where is that going to shake out on the balance? And I think that's something we really want to be thinking about.
Thanks for that, Alison. So we just have a couple minutes left before we turn it over to Haven to pull some questions down. But I wanted to give Ethan and Sean just a couple minutes each to just hit on those things. I won't take us back to Genesis to argue about whether we're part of the ecosystem or not. But so go ahead, Ethan.
Yeah, so I would say that we can sort of think about managing recreation, in light of these climatic changes. In a couple different ways. I mean, one way that we can think about it is, managing recreation as something that is integrated with the other ways that we want to manage forests at this moment. So, like thinking about how we create, forest management infrastructure, for instance, that is also recreational infrastructure, and how do we make that infrastructure hardened, and build it for maybe not even like the disturbances that we have now, the rain that we have now, the other issues that we have now, but what we will have. Something that I'm also very interested though, and something that when I was managing these community forests, small scale public lands, was in thinking about how do we create forest management infrastructure, which is separate from recreational infrastructure, recognizing that we are going to need to, and we want to, go into ecosystems to do these management interventions, and we don't even know what those could be in the future, but that we need to protect that access infrastructure so that we can go in there to take steps to do stuff, right? To protect biodiversity, to manage for human benefits, for all of these other things. And, if we think about the barriers that would prevent us from doing that, we have all these climatic barriers, we have increased, these really intense rain events and other heightened disturbances. And then another one is also like, again, not to keep on bringing up the same thing, but then, potential human opposition to the work that we do, or to losing access to the recreational trail networks. So, it's very easy to put a recreational trail right on top of a haul road, right? Or a skid trail. But one thing that does, in my experience, is then it makes it very difficult when we need to mobilize that infrastructure for forest management purposes, because suddenly these people are losing their trail. Whereas if we'd done a little bit more planning and actually cited that recreational infrastructure as either like, crossing that forest management infrastructure in the same way that a skid trail might cross like a stream, right? So that we can mitigate the physical impact to that, or cited so that we can close areas of recreational trail infrastructure while keeping other areas open, that we can actually limit opposition to the management work that we need to do and increase like the public acceptance. So just recognizing that like we want recreation, we also want forest management. We want to set ourselves up so in the future, when we need to do forest management, folks can have their recreational infrastructure intact. And I think that that's something, a part of planning that we really need to think of. Just again, recognizing that access to forests is not just about even us being able to manage this resource. It's not just about us wanting to get into these areas in principle, but it may be about us being able to like perform pretty vital ecosystem stewardship actions now and in the future. And we want to protect those.
Perfect. Thank you, Ethan. And that probably sets up Sean pretty well, Sean. So if you can take about 2 minutes, Sean, and then we'll turn it over to Haven for questions.
Sure. Just real quick, Ethan had some great ideas and suggestions there. Maybe just expanding on that a little bit, but also taking it back a little bit with broader communication piece. I think that there is a place for good signage with effective messaging. I think that folks may not always appreciate the short-term inconveniences of what some of this management entails, if it means temporarily closing a preferred access trail, for example. But I think that they understand, they get it with the long-term benefits. If they understand that Winter Hall Road, for example, is going to be maintained because of the forest management activities. And if they understand that the habitat is going to be improved in a certain manner so that the species that they're looking for while they're visiting will continue to be there. So I think that the right signage can be effective, and realizing that with limited budgets, we can only communicate so much. And, those realities are hard to navigate. So I think as public land managers, we do as best we can with some effective messaging and try to get folks to understand the long-term benefits of this work.
Great. Thanks, Sean. So now I'm going to turn it over to Haven Barnhill, who is part of our team that puts on this webinar series. And Haven's been watching the questions come in, and he'll kick them over to our panel. And you guys, Haven may send it directly to one of you, but again, for the most part, I think it's you guys. If you want to grab it, grab it. Go ahead, Haven.
Thanks, Jeff, and great information. We're getting some good questions in the Q&A, and please keep adding them there to the Q&A. We also had a lot of comments in the chat and a couple of questions around invasives, and they were a little bit management specific, but rather than delving that deep, let's back up just a little bit and talk about the impacts of recreation on invasives, and importantly, is there an opportunity or more opportunity to engage citizen science to help us address some of those challenges?
Who wants to grab a hold of that one? Let's see, Kathryn.
Yeah, so I would say generally, I think there is an opportunity to engage more with citizen scientists. There's an organization that I haven't looked into in a while, but I think it's called Adventure Scientists, and that's like specifically what they do. They have like sort of what I would call like extreme sports people. They're like hiking up a very tall mountain with ice axes, and they're like collecting data and contributing it. So I definitely think that that's a possibility. I am not an expert in citizens that like how to set that up or like what the background would be, but I think that it could definitely be an interesting idea and probably work. And maybe I'll look more into this Adventure Scientist while I'm not talking and see if that kind of gets that question a bit more. I know that this year we have signs up at like our trailheads around invasive spread, and then always trying to get information to people before they're at a trailhead or a place is always like a challenge.
I think that one of the real nuts to crack that anyone on here who has done management of recreation on public, especially or private lands, knows that, like, I think one of the holy grails of our work would be finding a way to convert recreationalists into conservationists, right? And to like mobilize like this tremendous amount of power and will that we have in these recreational communities into like, you know, good outcomes for conservation. And like, so one of the things with invasive plants could be like, if we had better monitoring, you know, like think about what that would allow for invasive plants or pests, with some pests, think about what that would allow us to do, you know, and how much more like nimble and targeted and effective it would allow us to be at controlling those species. But then, you know, I know that everyone who's also done that work is like probably tried that or thought about that, and it's like that's never going to work. And so let's just challenge ourselves to like keep on thinking about that, because having that many people out in the woods that are doing something that they love, which is relying on ecosystems, is an incredible potential asset. And I think we need to continue to think about like how we can figure out how to engage those people and mobilize that energy into doing stuff like, you know, being better in the way that we respond to these introduced pests.
Yeah, and if I can jump in and build on that a little bit, I think I really love the examples that Ethan and Kathryn have both used, because I think those are examples of when information may be the piece that's needed, right? Like really high alpine environments that are hard to get to, it might be really hard for a lot of research scientists to collect data there, because there's another skill set that is required to get to some of those areas. And so having folks who already have those skill sets and sort of morphing them into scientists in some ways might actually be easier. That may be a good use of that resource. Or, you know, we have invasive plants popping up all over the place. And so more monitoring is like always helpful for early intervention. I think we've seen a lot of citizen science that I think is really great in a lot of ways, and particularly as an engagement tool, but is just creating sort of more information that people might use, but without a particular management goal in mind. And when we're thinking about these issues of interactions between people and nature in the context of recreation, a lot of the times the questions are management questions, they're political questions, they're questions about like, what can we do? And maybe not like, do we have enough information to decide what to do? Sometimes that's the case, sometimes it isn't. And I think targeting those citizen science efforts and that will toward the places where the issue is the information, and then being really clear-headed about the places where the issue maybe is not the information, but is getting the political will or the organizational ability to be able to implement a certain decision that needs to be made, and putting citizen science sort of in the right place there.
Thank you. A totally different question. Public interaction also includes local economic development agencies and community growth advocates. How should that be considered in our management challenges and in recreation opportunities?
I didn't mention this earlier, but this does link into the outdoor recreation economy was included in the officially included by a statute in, I think, 2016, signed, I think, during the Obama administration, which added outdoor recreation to the national GDP, and sort of parallel to that occurring, states had started forming something called what's now called the Confluence of States. And out of that have come outdoor offices of recreation. They're not in every state. I think they're in about around 20 states currently. There's one in Vermont, Vermont Outdoor Recreation Economic Council. And I think that there's like give and take in those relationships, and the way that it's emerged. It's cool that NAR, with GNAR, out of Utah Extension, has a lot of resources around how towns and communities can start dealing with that idea of not only both the natural resource management, but also sort of like cultural management of your small town and what that might look like if it changes because of economic development. I'm not quite sure if that's what the question was getting at, but there are resources, and there's the Society of Outdoor Recreation Professionals is a national professional organization for like planners and land managers, and also has folded in some folks from the outdoor recreation economy to start having those inter discussions. The Outdoor Recreation Roundtable does a lot of work around the outdoor recreation economy as well. So it's a good question, and there are people out there working on how to make sure everything's sort of happening together instead of versus.
All right, thank you. Question, someone was asking if there were examples on managing people's expectation, our visitors' expectations on usage, and even conveying that they should expect change when we, if we're to maintain healthy, dynamic recreational opportunities, then change in expectation may be necessary. How do you manage that with people visiting?
So I can tell you just what I've done, and I think there's a lot to this, right? We could do a whole presentation just about how to effectively communicate to folks. I think that to the question asker, expecting change, and expecting even like maybe discomfort, and inviting them into like a process where we learn about this stuff, and can be very effective. I think that one really important part of it is people do not like to be surprised. And so, in my communication projects, I really focused on trying to make the knowledge of the work that we were going to do, in this case on these community forests in these very small communities, to make it unavoidable, to really recognize that people consume information in different places and different ways, and we need to kind of reach them where they are. And that was sort of my thought in starting the social media channels that I now run, was like, this is where people are, and this is where people get information. And so there's sort of a mechanical aspect to it of like how we reach them and where we reach them. And it's really important to have this whole process where you set expectations and bring people in a certain way before you do anything. And then there's a whole process that occurs while you're doing the thing, and then there should be a whole process that occurs after you do the thing. Because one thing that I've really realized is that you go do some forest management, and people see that the forest not only has changed, but looks objectively worse than it did before you did that management. And so hopefully you've primed them for that. But afterwards, people are still going to need to be interacting with that area that has changed. And then way afterwards, when it's all become like the most beautiful habitat you could possibly imagine, you need to be able to like show people the connection between that and the work that actually happened, because what happens is they forget. So that's a part of it, experimenting with like creative ways to do signage, creative ways to do outreach. In those story maps that I shared in the chat, I think it's very powerful that we mobilize partnerships, right? So that as we're communicating these issues to people, it's not just the Forest Service or the state agency or the forester, that it's actually like, grouping together all of these different conservation organizations, and even organizations that we don't typically think of as being part of our traditional forest management coalition, but which have these constituencies and have public trust, and to help them do this project together. And I think that can be very, very, very powerful. And I if you look at the story maps that I shared, a lot of it is just about how, I figured this out in a couple very specific cases, but I think with some insight into, tools that we might be able to use more broadly.
That was great. I can't build on that, but I just wanted to add, when it comes to communication measures, as land managers, we just might not be aware of some of the communication tools that other folks within our organizations or agencies are using, similar to how Ethan is using social media. We're not all well versed in that. And so it's taking that time when we are building a plan to just bounce ideas off of other people in order to gain insight and to iterate and to build a better plan. So in the example that I put in the chat for the Mark Twain National Forest, because of that interdisciplinary team, the engineers are working their magic, thinking about how we're going to harden structures, we're going to move stuff. There was the foresters who were thinking about the new riparian buffers, but then we had folks who were thinking about the physical safety of the campers, and they were saying, oh, we need a new alert system. Maybe we just need an actual light and an alarm that we can just press. We can have the people who work at the facility or come down and just press it. So there's a visual indication that there is an emergency, because we know cell phone service is spotty and we can't count on everyone having that cell phone on hand when the alert goes out. So it's really bringing people all to the table can help us, create or even think outside of the box when it comes to those traditional modes of communication. Yeah, and Kathryn, I see you went off mute, so I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, this is mine is again about the Burroughs project, but the communications there, that's a really popular trail in our, in Camel Sump State Park. And so even though we were just rebuilding it, there were still trail crews out there, things looked different when you were hiking. And so I worked closely with the Green Mountain Club, who is our partner organization, on that, because they have a stronger, well built out communication arm. And so they were pushing out a lot. They helped us make posters with QR codes. So if people had questions, it would link right back. So some expectation setting is hard to do because it's for something unexpected. And it's just okay, now what do we do? But for those places where it is a plan, or it is a timber harvest, or you are just doing a big project on a beloved trail that is going to maybe look different for some people, definitely leveraging those partnerships and thinking of the different ways because we had on-site communication. I even hired an intern that year just to both capture the work that was being done and get little behind the scenes snippets of the trail crews, because I think something that people don't understand is the trail crews who worked on that project were living in the woods for 5 days at a time. And people are oh, we thought the staircases were just there. And you're no. People physically moved those rocks and set them, and were soaking wet because it rained all week. So also just sort of depending on what type of recreation infrastructure we're talking about, some of it is just really hard and really expensive to fix. And so also making sure in all the expectation setting that you're also telling the story of this is why it takes so long or is such a big deal for it to be fixed, is because it takes a lot of logistics and energy and people. So yeah, that again, that expectation works, for a discrete project. That's going to be harder for more broad.
I think it can be very powerful to both of your points, Danielle and Kathryn, to instead of being people can't handle the nuance of the work that we do, and so we just need to really manage the small amount of information that we give them, to think about what it would be to instead invite people into these complex decision-making processes as much as we can, and to show them that the reason that we're doing the thing that maybe makes no sense to them is not because we're thinking less about it. It's because we're thinking so much harder about it, right? And we're really investigating these incredibly nuanced realities, and to show people the incredible amount of work and all of the people who, by the way, it's easy to be oh, they screwed up the Burroughs Trail, or they screwed up this forest I love, or whatever. people think about when things change. And it's much harder when you're like, oh, this is actually like the collaborative effort of, I don't know, dozens of different people, each of whom has their own conservation ethic and has dedicated their lives to these things and values all of these different, diverse interests and objectives. And, you can't give people all of that information all the time, but I think that should be our goal, is to actually like bring people deeper into the process as we do these things, because I feel like there's a lot of important information there and a lot of important messaging that can be done with that.
You are hitting them out of the park. One more, I think we have time for another question. This one is related to story maps. So we haven't talked a lot about story maps, but I think there was a reference or two in the chat. And someone asked, how effective do you find story maps to be? Does the general public seek out the story maps and use the content? Some organizations use them very regularly as kind of a hot new tool. But this person didn't think his parents would even have a clue how to find or read one. What are you experiencing relative to new tools like a story map?
Raise your hand if you've used a story map. They're cool, right? Yeah. I think so. The way that I've used story maps is probably, I know that there's a lot of people who are using them in a really cool way. I've used them just as a storytelling tool to be like, we did this project and now here's a way that I can like package up all this information, and they make it it makes it beautiful, big pictures and links, and you can have a single link where you can tell the story of like a whole project, right? And I know that there's other uses for it as well, but I think that there also needs to be like analog options as well, right? And if we're trying to reach everybody.
Yeah, I don't have, my position does not involve interfacing with the general public. I suppose, as I believe it was meant here, all that much, maybe beyond things like this, which in some ways this is general public to me, though I think many people here are still land managers. But the way I think about communication, and I think this is obvious, but I also think it's important enough to be worth repeating, is that like, it really just depends on what you're trying to communicate and to whom, and in what context. I think story maps, do I think people are going and seeking them out actively as a place to get their information? No, I do not, for the most part. But I do think, as Ethan said, that if you create a story map, that can be a really great thing to be sending out to people, that can be really helpful for a lot of folks, and that's not going to work for everybody, or it might not be appropriate for the story you're trying to tell or the context. If telling the story of the whole project when people are not in that place is useful and makes sense, then a story map is great. But if you want to do something interpretive where it's really helpful for people to see, here's exactly what's going on in this site, and I can interact with that, I can have a reaction to that and then understand something about it, then something in place that's not digital probably will be more effective. And also, some people aren't going to engage with those things in place. I mean, I know that we've probably all been to places with interpretive signage where maybe nerds like me will be reading all the signs and everybody else in the group is like a mile ahead because they haven't looked at a single one of the signs. So you really need to think about, like, who are you trying to capture? Are you trying to capture nerds like me? Or are you trying to capture somebody else? And how can you do that in the most effective way?
Yeah, I just want to, great points, Alison. I just want to echo something in the chat that caught my attention, which is by Rick. It says, you need to avoid the "if you build it, they will come." And I think that gets at Ethan's points earlier, is that when we're doing a story map, we should be doing it for a purpose, as Alison, mentioned as well. Like, who's that audience? I don't really love story maps myself, but I have found them to be a really effective tool in communicating something that is incredibly complex and would take me hours to explain. So I do like them. But I just really liked that. It is not a one size fits all box, for sure. There are lots of really interesting communication tools, and I would dare say even more than all all of us oldies can even conceptualize right now. So when the new folks come up with ideas, it's good to run with them too, because they might actually offer a whole new opportunity to meet audiences that we're not meeting right now.
So I wanted to share, someone, Kathryn Schmidt just posted to the chat, is it a story map if it doesn't have a map? You can integrate on, ArcGIS online maps, and they can have maps, but they don't have to. Actually, none of mine have active maps. Mostly it's just like, it's almost like a slideshow that you scroll through. So I wanted to just share one thing that I utilize in my communications work, where I have these like social media channels, and I have my websites, and I have writing, and like, a concept that I've taken from the data visualization world, which by the way is super powerful and interesting field of study, is that you should provide people with the opportunity to step down into the data, or maybe in this case, into the story, into the information. So you should have like a way for them to interact with it for people who want to interact in a very superficial way. And then think about how, for the people who are interested, how do we take them then a little bit deeper? And for the people who are interested, how do we take them a little bit deeper? And, so maybe the first level of this is something like a sign, or maybe it's a social media post, or it's something like that. And for people who want to go deeper, maybe it's a story map. And for the people who want to go deeper, maybe it's access to all of this tree of different resources, or it's interpretive walks, or it's other things. But I think that we need to understand that people interact with, recreationalists and others interact with this information in different ways, and they want to go to different levels, right? And so we need to provide information that meets them kind of where they are. And a story map is pretty deep, right? A story map is not a superficial thing. So we need to think about how we get them there as well.
We have just a few minutes before we wrap up. Jeff, any closing thoughts from you or the panelists?
Yeah, so first of all, this turned out, thank you, Haven, and thanks for grabbing the questions. And I just wanted to thank the panelists and all our participants. We have a great group of participants. The questions were awesome, and so I just really want to thank the panel. We have lots of conversations before we put these things on, so I appreciate the time that you guys put into it. And I also want to say to our participants, next September 16th, we have our urban refuge conversation about, finding refuge in suburbia, managing forests in urban areas. And I also wanted to remind folks we're changing over to Teams. So be looking for some email communications, maybe from Gwyneth as we change these over. These are always adventures, but we'll try to treat you well through the process. With that, again, one more thank you to our panelists, to Danielle, to Kathryn, to Alison, to Sean, to Ethan. You guys were great. You really brought some cool perspectives. Thanks again. And with that, Gwyneth, is there anything else you need to say before we run away?
No, I think we're good to go. Thank you so much, our presenters. You guys did a great job.